Why did she feel invisible in a crowd where every life carried its own story? The airport pulsed with the rhythm of departures and arrivals. Rolling suitcases rattled across polished tiles, announcements echoed in practiced tones, and strangers brushed past each other without truly seeing. She blended into that sea of motion, a woman in her mid-30s carrying herself with quiet composure. Her jacket was folded carefully over her arm, her bag small and unassuming. Nothing about her invited notice. Nothing gave away what lived beneath the surface. To the boarding agent, she was only a number on a screen, passenger 89. She offered a polite smile when her boarding pass beeped approval, but it faded quickly as though her mind was elsewhere. On the jet bridge she inhaled, catching that familiar cocktail of recycled air and the faint bite of jet fuel. She had traveled countless times before, but this moment carried a different weight, though she couldn't have explained why. Some journeys announce themselves only in hindsight. Inside the cabin of Flight 217, ordinary lives unfolded in miniature dramas. A businessman cursed quietly at an overhead bin. A young mother whispered comfort to her crying toddler. A teenager already locked into his headphones scrolled his phone in practiced detachment. Each of them was caught in their own small orbit, unaware that their paths were about to collide in ways none could imagine. Passenger 89 walked steadily down the aisle until she found her seat near the wing. She slid into place, buckled her belt, and placed her small bag beneath the seat. Her hands folded neatly in her lap, though her gaze drifted toward the window. The runway stretched into the haze of a September morning, and for a moment she saw her reflection staring back, calm, unreadable, distant. The engines roared awake, sending a vibration through the cabin. Safety announcements played. Most passengers tuned them out. She didn't. She never did. Every detail imprinted itself on her mind, the motions of the flight attendants, the tone of the instructions, the rhythm of words most ignored. For her, such things had never been background noise. They were signals, reminders that routine was only an illusion and that the line between order and chaos was fragile, often invisible. The aircraft lumbered forward, gathering speed until the ground released them. Her chest lifted with the climb, her hand steadying on the armrest until the plane leveled into its ascent. Clouds swallowed the windows, the cabin shook, and then stabilized into its usual rhythm. Drinks carts rattled. Conversations flared and faded. People relaxed, convinced their journey was safe. Remained silent. Her fingers traced the edge of the window, tapping softly. Her thoughts drifted far back to a time she rarely revisited, a small airfield, headphones clamped over her ears, an instructor's voice guiding her through the clipped language of aviation radio. It had been another lifetime, abandoned when her life bent in different directions, but some lessons carved themselves into the bone. The cadence of call signs, the demand for calm under pressure, the discipline of voice when silence could kill. She had not touched a panel in over a decade, yet she could still hear those voices in memory, sharp, precise, steady. Around her, the cabin thrummed with the small noise of life. A man spoke too loudly about a deal he was closing. A woman scribbled furiously into a notebook. A flight attendant poured coffee with practiced grace. Nothing about Flight 217 seemed unusual, but sometimes ordinary life is a fragile disguise, waiting for a crack. Somewhere over the Midwest, sunlight dulled into a pale silver haze. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom, warm and reassuring. "Ladies, and we're at cruising altitude. Weather ahead looks favorable. Sit back, relax, and enjoy the flight." A polite ripple of applause followed. She closed her eyes, listening not just to his words but to his cadence. Pilots carried composure like armor, but she knew how easily armor could crack. For her, time stretched differently. She wasn't restless or distracted. She simply watched. The tilt of the wings, the clouds, the slight stiffness in the flight attendants' movements when they whispered in the galley, tiny details most dismissed. But she noticed. Not because of fear, because of habit. Some part of her had never stopped paying attention, never stopped listening for the sound beneath the sound. The plane pressed westward, slicing through the endless sky. Children napped. The businessman finally surrendered, closing his laptop. A hush draped the cabin. For a moment it felt peaceful. Then she felt it. A low stutter beneath the floor, barely perceptible but real, a flicker of light across the galley panel. Her pulse quickened. She turned back to the window, steadying her breath. No one else seemed to notice. Not yet, but she did. In the cockpit, the ripple of unease began. A flicker across the communications panel, static cutting across channels. The captain adjusted dials, muttering about interference. The second officer frowned. Then another channel fell silent, and another. Kansas City Center, this is Flight 217. Radio check. Silence. The hum of the aircraft seemed heavier, as though the weight of the sky itself had shifted. Back in the cabin, nothing seemed amiss. Passengers laughed softly. Children fidgeted. A flight attendant poured another drink. But she caught the small signals, the way crew members' smiles faltered when they passed each other notes, the quiet urgency in their eyes. She knew that kind of silence. The silence professionals wear like a mask, hiding their uncertainty from those who depend on them. And then the illusion shattered. The aircraft jolted hard, trays rattling, cups spilling. Gasps filled the cabin as turbulence shook the fuselage. A baby shrieked. Then came the hiss, sharp and startling. Yellow masks spilled from overhead compartments, dangling like strange fruit. Panic erupted. Hands clawed at straps. Children cried. Some passengers froze in terror. Others yanked masks down, fumbling with shaking fingers. The businessman cursed loudly, his mask tangled in elastic. She slipped hers on calmly, tightening it with practiced ease, then reached to help the panicked woman beside her. Her touch was steady, her nod reassuring. Calm radiated outward in small ripples. Up front, alarms screamed across the cockpit. Altitude fluctuated. Lights flashed. The radios remained dead. The captain's jaw tightened as he muttered to his first officer. "Back up, gone too. Nothing's transmitting." They were blind, silent in the skis, and silence in these skis meant suspicion. In the cabin, fear spread like fire. A man shouted prayers in the aisle. A flight attendant forced a smile that couldn't mask the tremor in her hands. Rumors sparked. Hijacking, bombs, sabotage. But she knew better. Silence didn't always mean danger from within. Sometimes it meant danger from without. Her pulse slowed, her resolve hardening. She unbuckled her. "Ma'am, please remain seated," a flight attendant urged, panic sharpening her voice. She met her eyes. "Take me to the cockpit." The attendant froze. "You can't." "I know what to do." Her voice carried no desperation, only calm authority. Something in her tone, measured, steady, certain, broke through the haze of panic. The attendant hesitated, then glanced at the cockpit door. Muffled alarms still screamed behind it. She nodded once quickly. "Follow me." Passengers turned to stare as she walked forward, their whispers rising in fear. Some thought she might be part of the danger, but her calm stride silenced them more effectively than words. The reinforced door cracked open. Alarms shrieked from within, and in that moment her role shifted. She was no longer simply passenger 89. She was a voice stepping into silence. What would they see when she stepped through that reinforced door? A frightened civilian, or something else entirely? The cockpit was chaos. Lights flashed red across panels. Alarms shrieked. The captain's hands moved frantically across switches, as though one more adjustment might restore the silence into sound. The first officer was drenched in sweat, muttering under his breath while toggling backup systems. They were men trained to steady chaos, but their tools had betrayed them. And then she entered. She slipped into the jump seat with a quiet certainty that disarmed them both. No fumbling, no hesitation. Her hands locked the harness as if she'd done it countless times before. The captain's head snapped toward her, his voice sharp and incredulous. "Who are you? This is restricted." Her reply was calm, too calm for the moment. "Radios are dead, let me help." The first officer bristled. "You can't just." She cut him off, her voice firm. "You're flying blind, and in minutes they'll scramble fighters. Do you really want silence to be your only answer?" The words landed like a hammer. The pilots froze. Her statement wasn't guesswork, it was knowledge. And in their gut, both men knew she was right. Silence in American skies was more than an inconvenience. It was a trigger. The captain hesitated, his jaw set. He gestured sharply. "Fine, you don't touch the flight controls, only comms, understood?" She nodded, understood. Her hands moved across the secondary panel, flipping protective covers, checking dials. They didn't fumble. They didn't search. They moved with memory. Years-old training clawed its way back through muscle and instinct. She adjusted knobs, pressed transmit, and spoke into the microphone. "Mayday, mayday, mayday. This is Flight 217, passenger transmission. We've lost primary communication. Do you copy?" Only static answered, hissing like a cruel reminder of their isolation. The captain exhaled sharply, despair bleeding into his movements. But she pressed again, her voice unwavering. "Civilian Flight 217, passenger transmitting. Communication systems failure, crew intact, requesting response." 5 seconds of silence, then a crackle. "Flight 217, repeat. Did you say passenger transmitting?" Relief flickered across her face. She leaned closer, voice clipped, professional. "Affirmative, passenger relaying for the crew. Systems failure. Flight 217 secure, requesting assistance." On the ground, controllers exchanged stunned words. A passenger speaking for an aircraft. It was absurd, impossible, reckless. Yet her tone carried authority, the cadence of someone who belonged behind a radio, not in row 22. The captain stared at her, disbelief softening into something else, gratitude. For the first time since the alarms began, the cockpit felt tethered. But outside those windows, the sky held another danger. Far away, military radars had already flagged Flight 217 as a ghost. Silent, transponder dark, unresponsive, a shape in the sky that could not be trusted. And 2 A-10 Warthogs had just left the ground. She didn't know it yet, but her voice would soon carry further than she had ever imagined, into cockpits built for war, into the ears of pilots trained not to listen but to judge. The cockpit pressed forward under her words. Controllers fired questions: altitude, heading, souls on board. She relayed calmly, her voice a lifeline binding them together. Each answer landed like a stone across a fragile bridge. The pilots followed her words, responding through her as if she had become their third crew member. The captain leaned toward her, his voice rough. "Where did you learn this?" She didn't look away from the panel. "Years ago, aviation radio training. It never really leaves you." For a moment he studied her face. She didn't flinch, she didn't break. He turned back to the controls, that was enough. But the silence behind their communications never truly eased. Controllers confirmed their signals were weak, unstable. "Flight 217, maintain heading. Be advised, intercept inbound. Do not deviate. Do you copy?" Her chest tightened, but her voice didn't waver. "Copy. Civilian Flight 217, maintaining heading. Negative hostile intent." The captain closed his eyes briefly. "They're coming." She nodded once. "Then we'll make sure they know exactly who we are." In the cabin, passengers sensed change without knowing why. A tremor in the aircraft's rhythm, a whisper among the crew, rumors ignited, hijackers, bombs, theories fueled by silence. A businessman muttered curses. A woman sobbed quietly into her hands. Flight attendants forced strained smiles, but even their voices cracked. One attendant slipped to the cockpit door. "They're asking what's happening. They're terrified." The captain shook his head. "Tell them nothing they don't need to know." But passenger 89 turned slightly, still holding the mic. "Tell them this, the situation is being handled." And it is. The attendant blinked at her, startled by the certainty in her voice. Then she nodded and left, carrying words steadier than her own. Inside the cockpit, seconds stretched, silence pressed like a weight. Then it came. A clipped voice, colder than civilian tones. Unidentified aircraft. This is Viper 1, state your status. The cockpit froze, military. Her pulse quickened, but she pressed the mic, voice controlled. Viper 1, this is civilian flight 217. We are in distress. Repeat, distress. No hostile intent. Communication systems failure. The silence that followed was suffocating. Every soul in the cockpit seemed to hold breath, waiting for judgment to arrive in the pause. Finally, the voice returned. Copy 217, stand by. The captain gripped the yoke. The first officer whispered, "They've got eyes on us." Still, outside the windows there was only haze and cloud. No shadow, no steel wings. Yet she could feel them out there, climbing closer. Her voice didn't falter. Flight 217, maintaining heading and altitude as instructed. Request visual confirmation when in range. Another pause, then the reply, "We'll confirm shortly." Her grip tightened on the mic. She knew what confirmation meant. A-10s didn't climb into the sky to chat. They came with purpose. They came with orders, and if her words didn't convince them, those orders might turn fatal. Passengers pressed their faces to narrow windows, squinting at the clouds. Some swore they saw shapes moving within. A murmur spread through the aisles, rising like a storm. Panic bubbled again. The first officer leaned forward suddenly, pointing through the glass. "There." And then they saw it. A silhouette emerging from haze, gray, angular, wings like blades slicing the air. An A-10 Warthog slid into formation, its armored body glinting in sunlight. A moment later, its twin appeared on the opposite side, bracketing the civilian jet in silent menace. Gasps tore through the cabin. Mothers clutched children. Passengers whispered, voices trembling. Some cried openly. A word rippled through the rows, fighters. In the cockpit, she leaned into the mic. Her tone was clear, deliberate. Viper 1, visual confirmed. Civilian aircraft flight 217. Request escort, negative hostile intent. The reply came, clipped but softer. Copy 217, hold course, we're with you. The captain exhaled heavily, his face etched with relief and exhaustion. They believe you. Her gaze stayed fixed on the gray silhouettes outside, their cannons pointed ahead but their presence undeniable. She spoke softly, not for him but for herself. They needed a voice they could trust, so we gave them one. And for the first time since the silence began, the sky carried not just fear but fragile hope. Yet that hope was razor-thin. For one wrong word, one misread signal, could still turn protectors into executioners. She knew it, the pilots knew it, and the fighters circling outside knew it too. But as the jet pressed westward under their watch, her voice remained its shield, the only barrier between hundreds of innocent souls and the roar of war. How much weight could a single voice carry when steel wings circled with cannons armed? The first sight of the A-10 spread like wildfire through the cabin. Passengers gasped, faces pressed against windows, words tumbling out in fragments. "Oh my God, they've sent fighters. Are we under attack?" The air filled with sharp whispers and choked cries. The businessman who had scoffed at inconvenience hours before now sat trembling, his lips moving soundlessly in prayer. Mothers shielded children's eyes. Some passengers clutched strangers' hands without shame. The flight attendants hurried down the aisles, arms raised, their voices straining to calm the panic. But even their practiced tones cracked with fear. No amount of polished professionalism could soften the sight of armored war machines flying close enough that their gray bodies glinted in sunlight. Inside the cockpit, the view was even harsher. To the left, a blunt-nosed Warthog flew steady, its engines vibrating the air. To the right, its twin mirrored every movement. Their presence was unyielding, their formation perfect. Flight 217 was no longer just flying. It was under escort. The captain muttered bitterly, his knuckles white on the yoke. "Damn it, if they don't believe us." "They will," she interrupted firmly. Her voice left no room for doubt. The first officer turned to her, disbelief etched into his features. "How can you be so sure?" She adjusted the mic, her eyes fixed on the war machine shadowing their fragile fuselage. "Because I'm not going to give them a reason to doubt." Static hissed, then the clipped military voice returned. "Flight 217, this is Viper 1. You are in restricted airspace and unresponsive to standard hails. State intentions immediately." Her grip tightened on the mic. Every instinct told her this was the moment. The line between life and death could be carved by words. Her voice was calm, deliberate, unwavering. "Viper 1, this is civilian flight 217. We are experiencing total communications failure. This is a passenger relaying. Crew intact. Repeat, crew intact. No hostile intent. Request escort to Denver." The silence that followed stretched painfully. Even the hum of the engines felt suspended, waiting. Finally, another voice cut in, not as sharp, curious. "Passenger 89, this is Viper 2. Say again you're a passenger." Her chest tightened, but she answered without hesitation. "Affirmative, civilian passenger, transmitting to maintain communication. Aviation training years ago. Crew unable to restore comms. I am bridge." The line crackled faintly, and then unexpectedly the hardened voice softened. "You've got nerves of steel, 89. We read you loud and clear." The captain exhaled, his lips parting as if he'd forgotten how to breathe. The first officer let out a shaky laugh. "They believe her." She didn't look at them. Her gaze stayed forward, her body rigid, every ounce of focus funneled into the words that kept steel wings from turning their cannons inward. In the cabin, panic still smoldered. Passengers pointed, some crying, others frozen. One flight attendant slipped into the cockpit, eyes wide. "They're asking what's happening. They saw the fighters. They're terrified." She turned slightly, still holding the mic. "Tell them this. The fighters are here to protect us, not harm us. Tell them they'll get us home." The attendant stared at her, startled by the certainty in her tone. She nodded quickly, almost gratefully, and hurried back. And so a new word began to ripple through the rows, whispered from one frightened passenger to another. "Protectors. Not attackers. Not executioners, protectors." The atmosphere shifted, fragile but real. Fear remained, sharp and cutting, but alongside it came something else, the smallest thread of hope. The cockpit, though, remained taut with tension. She kept transmitting, her cadence steady. "Civilian flight 217 maintaining heading. Negative hostile intent. Request confirmation of escort to Denver." The reply came, firmer now but with a trace of respect. "Copy 217. Affirmative, maintain heading. We'll ride with you." A subtle weight lifted from the captain's shoulders. His jaw eased, though fatigue carved heavy lines across his face. "They're not hunting us anymore," he murmured. "They're guarding us." She allowed herself a faint exhale. Not relief, not yet, but recognition. The tide had shifted. Still, the warthogs hovered close, their silhouettes reminders of how thin the line was between protection and destruction. One wrong move, one misinterpreted dip, and everything could still unravel. She knew it. The pilots knew it. Even the escorts knew it. She leaned closer to the mic. "Viper 1, Viper 2, this is Flight 217. Confirm escort to Denver, runway assignment when available." The response was clipped, professional, but softer. "Affirmative 217. Maintain altitude, corridor being prepared. We've got your back." Her voice steadied as she replied. "Copy Viper, maintaining heading, thank you for escort." The reply carried something unexpected. "Roger that, 89. You sound like you've done this before." Her lips twitched faintly, though her eyes stayed locked on the panel. "Once, a long time ago, but not like this." The cockpit grew quiet for a beat, the silence no longer hostile. It was companionable, filled with respect unspoken. Outside, the sun began to tilt westward, painting the clouds in amber and gold. The A-10s shimmered in fading light, their armored bodies glowing as though carved from fire. Some passengers pressed their faces to the glass, all mingling with fear. For the first time since the nightmare began, the sight of steel wings carried not just menace, but strange beauty. The child who had sobbed hours earlier now tugged on his mother's sleeve, pointing at the silhouette outside. "Is that our protector?" he whispered. His mother's eyes filled with tears. She nodded quickly. "Yes, our protector." And the word spread again, softer this time but firmer. "Protector." The businessman who had once cursed the flight attendants now stared silently at the war machine, his lips still moving in prayer, but no longer in terror. In gratitude. Inside the cockpit, she kept her headset tight, her voice clipped and precise, transmitting without fail. But fatigue pressed into her ribs. Her throat burned from hours of steady tone. Her hands trembled slightly when she lowered the mic for only a second. She masked it well. To the pilots beside her, she was still steel, but inside her body whispered of limits. Static cracked suddenly, breaking the lull. "Passenger 89, this is Viper 2. How are you holding up?" She blinked. For hours their exchanges had been sterile, procedural, clipped. This question was different, human. Her lips parted and she allowed herself a trace of honesty. Holding, focused. A faint chuckle buzzed back through the headset. "Could fooled me. Sound like you've been doing this all your life." Her eyes stayed on the altimeter, her tone dry but steady. "Not my life, just long enough to know words can carry weight." "Roger that," Viper 2 replied, his voice thoughtful now. The captain glanced at her, curious, but he didn't ask. He had already seen enough to know her history carried more than she revealed. As dusk deepened into evening, shadows stretched across the clouds. Stars began to pierce the horizon. The city lights of Denver were still far, but faint whispers of them glowed in the distance. And through it all, two A-10s flanked them, their formation steady, their silence no longer a threat but a vow. The first officer finally spoke, his voice low. "If we make it down in Denver," his words trailed off. "We will," she said firmly, cutting off his doubt before it could take root. He turned toward her, searching her face. "How do you stay so certain?" Her eyes stayed forward. "Because certainty is all that stands between us and panic. Panic kills faster than fire." Neither man argued, they understood. And so the flight pressed on, held aloft not only by steel and fuel, but by a woman's steady voice threading through silence, binding strangers, warriors, and frightened passengers together. Her words had turned suspicion into belief, fear into fragile trust. And now, as the sky darkened around them, that trust was the only shield they had left. How long could one voice hold steady when hundreds of lives balanced on every word? The first hour under escort passed like a lifetime. The cabin had fallen into uneasy quiet, though fear lingered beneath every breath. Children whimpered against tired mothers' shoulders. Some passengers stared blankly through windows, watching the gray silhouettes outside as if staring at angels or executioners. The businessman who had shaken and muttered prayers earlier now sat frozen, eyes locked on the armored shape keeping pace beyond the glass. His lips moved silently, though no sound emerged. The flight attendants moved with hushed efficiency, coaxing water into trembling hands, reminding passengers to breathe. They repeated soft reassurances, but their own gazes drifted often to the windows, where steel guardians cast shadows across the fading light. In the cockpit, the air felt thin, stretched taut between relief and dread. The captain flew steady, his hands rigid on the yoke. The first officer monitored what systems still functioned, his jaw clenched, his voice clipped with fatigue. Passenger 89 sat between them, headset pressed tightly to her ears. Her body had become the bridge between silence and survival, the conduit binding a grounded world to a fragile vessel. Flight 217, maintain current heading. The voice of Viper 1 came calm, clipped professional. She responded instantly, her tone even unwavering. Copy Viper 1, heading confirmed. It repeated in cycles, cold procedure, call and response, but each exchange reinforced the fragile thread holding their world together. Her throat ached. Hours of speaking had carved fire into her voice. Her back throbbed from remaining upright, from refusing to yield to the exhaustion that pressed harder with each passing minute. She masked it well, her words steel, her posture controlled. But when she lowered her hands briefly from the mic, they trembled faintly. The captain and first officer never noticed. They only heard her strength. Static filled the lull between transmissions, a hiss that gnawed at nerves. Then, unexpectedly, a different tone slipped through the headset. Passenger 89, this is Viper 2. How you holding up? She blinked. For hours, the voices of the escorts had been clipped, procedural, stripped of humanity. This was different, human. Her lips parted, her answer honest but contained. Holding, focused. A low chuckle followed, faint through the static. Could fooled me. Sound like you've been doing this your whole life. Her eyes stayed locked on the altimeter. Her tone was steady, but dry humor edged in. Not my life, just long enough to know words can carry weight. The silence that followed was softer, respectful. The captain glanced at her sidelong, but he asked nothing. He didn't need to. He had seen enough. Outside, dusk deepened into evening. The clouds burned orange and red before fading into purple shadows. Then stars began to prick the horizon, sharp against the darkening sky. The A-10s shimmered in the last light, their armored bodies glowing as though lit from within. Passengers in the cabin gasped softly, torn between fear and awe. One child, small and wide-eyed, pressed his face to the window. His voice was barely a whisper, but it carried. Is that our protector? His mother's throat tightened, tears welled in her eyes as she nodded quickly. Yes, our protector. The word spread quietly, protector. It rolled through the rows, whispered into trembling ears. The flight attendants seized it, repeating it softly. They're here to protect us, to get us home. Fear did not vanish, but it shifted, loosening its chokehold just enough for passengers to breathe again. In the cockpit, the captain muttered under his breath, I still can't believe this, a passenger saving an airliner. She didn't answer. Her focus was too sharp, her voice too committed to falter. She wasn't thinking in terms of saving or heroism, only survival, only the next transmission, only the fragile bridge between silence and chaos. Denver Center, this is Flight 217. Passenger transmitting, crew intact, civilian only, negative hostile intent. Her words cut through static like a lifeline, each syllable precise, each pause measured. Controllers replied, their tones less strained now. They had adjusted, accepted, begun to trust, yet their instructions carried weight. Flight 217, you are cleared for corridor. Escort remains in place. Maintain altitude. Begin descent in 90 minutes. She relayed the message to the captain, her cadence flawless. The first officer leaned back against his seat with a shaky laugh. 90 more minutes of this. Her voice remained steady. We'll hold. But inside, her body screamed. Her throat burned. Her chest ached with the weight of it all. She buried it deep, sealing fatigue beneath discipline. The headset crackled again, this time softer, almost thoughtful. You've got calm, 89, Viper 2 said. Half my recruits would crack under this kind of pressure. Her lips curved faintly, though her tone remained steady. Maybe they haven't had to explain to 200 people why cannons are pointed at them. A low laugh buzzed back through static. Fair enough. The exchange was brief, but it carried weight. Respect, unspoken but real, passed between warriors of different kinds, one bound to a fighter jet, the other to a passenger seat. As the aircraft pressed westward, stars across the night sky. Shadows cloaked the earth below. Inside the cabin, passengers dozed fitfully, exhaustion finally conquering adrenaline. Others sat wide-eyed, unable to close their eyes with war machines packing their fragile vessel. The businessman who had trembled for hours now sat with his hands folded, his lips moving in silent prayer. But his eyes no longer darted wildly. They lingered on the warthog outside, reverence etched into his features. The atmosphere shifted, fragile but undeniable. The passengers had begun to see what the pilots already knew. Her voice had become their shield. In the cockpit, the first officer studied her profile in the dim glow of instruments. His voice was quiet, thoughtful. "How do you do it? How do you stay so steady?" Her eyes stayed locked forward. "Because certainty is the only thing standing between us and panic. Panic kills faster than fire." Neither man argued. They knew she was right. And so the aircraft pressed on, hour by hour, each second carried by her words. The A-10s remained flanking shadows, their engines a low growl in the night, their presence both menace and salvation. The headset crackled once more. Viper 1's tone was steady. "Flight 217, Denver approach preparing corridor. 40 minutes, stay steady." She responded instantly. "Copy Viper 1, 40 minutes to handoff, heading confirmed." Her throat burned. Her hands trembled when she lowered them briefly from the mic. But when she spoke, her voice remained steel. Because in that moment, hundreds of lives did not ride on the engines, the wings, or the hands of the pilots. They rode on her voice, unbroken, unshaken, unwavering. A voice that had turned suspicion into trust, fear into fragile hope. And now, as night stretched endlessly across the sky, it held the weight of salvation itself. What happens when hope is within sight, but still one mistake away from disaster? Denver's lights began to twinkle faintly in the distance, faint beacons against the dark horizon. To the passengers of Flight 217, they looked like salvation. To the pilots in the cockpit, they looked like judgment waiting at the end of a storm. And to her, passenger 89, they were a reminder that her work wasn't over. Not yet. For hours her voice had threaded through static, holding the fragile world together. Each call and response was a lifeline stretched across silence. Each word was measured, deliberate, sharp. But the descent, the critical phase, would test her in ways the climb and cruise never had. A wrong altitude, a missed instruction, a clipped phrase that betrayed doubt. Any of these could unravel everything they had fought for. Flight 217, the voice of Viper 1 cut through the headset, calm but firmer now. "Maintain heading. Begin descent corridor in 10 minutes. Confirm." She pressed the mic without hesitation. "Copy, Viper 1. Civilian Flight 217 beginning descent in 10 minutes. Heading confirmed." The captain turned toward her, his voice low, steady but edged with gravity. "This is where it matters most. Approach and landing, the hardest part." She nodded. "Then we'll do it together." The first officer muttered under his breath, "After all this, if we don't stick the landing." His words trailed off. He didn't need to finish. Everyone in the cockpit understood. She adjusted the mic, repeating the message to controllers. "Denver Center, this is Flight 217, passenger transmitting. Request clearance for final approach. Crew intact. Civilian aircraft. Repeat, civilian only." Static hummed before the controller's reply came back. "Copy, Flight 217. Runway 35 left prepared. Emergency crews standing by. Proceed with caution. Escort confirmed." Her voice steadied the confirmation. "Copy tower, proceeding to 35 left. Escort in place. Flight 217 maintains course." The captain adjusted dials. The first officer monitored flaps. The cockpit became a dance of precision, every movement deliberate. And over it all, her voice threaded commands and confirmations, each syllable carrying the weight of hundreds of souls. Back in the cabin, passengers had begun to sense the descent, the shift in pressure, the subtle dip in the aircraft's nose. Fear surged again, sharper now. Some whispered prayers, some clutched children closer. A few stared out the windows at the warthogs still packing them, trying to decipher whether they were angels or executioners. One flight attendant paused at the cockpit door. Her voice shook. "They're asking what's happening. They're scared." Passenger 89 turned slightly, still gripping the mic. "Tell them this, we're going home. The fighters are here to protect us until we touch down. Tell them to trust the wings outside." The attendant blinked, her own eyes wet, then nodded and slipped back into the cabin. Her words rippled like a current, fragile but powerful. Passengers clung to them. Protectors, home, trust. In the cockpit, turbulence rattled the fuselage as winds from the Rockies met the wings. The aircraft shuddered. Passengers gasped. A child cried out. The first officer's jaw tightened. Crosswinds, Denver's famous for them. The captain steadied the yoke. "We'll ride it out." Her voice cut through the tremor in the air. "Maintain glide slope. Adjust flaps gradually. Watch vertical speed." Her tone was calm, clipped, precise. But inside, her heart pounded. Each tremor in the air felt like a test, and every test demanded her steadiness. Static cracked again, this time the voice of Viper 2. "Passenger 89, this is Viper. You've done more than anyone thought possible. We've escorted a lot of planes, but never seen a passenger hold it together like this." Her throat burned, but she replied evenly. "Thank you, Viper 2, we're not there yet." The captain nodded, grim but approving. "She's right, not until wheels touch ground." The warthogs tightened their formation as the descent deepened. Their silhouettes loomed closer, their cannons still forward, but their presence no longer menacing. It was protective, steady. Guardians in steel wings. Inside the cabin, silence thickened. Passengers leaned into their seats, clutching armrests, their bodies mirroring the jet's movement. A mother whispered into her child's ear, "We're almost home." The child, wide-eyed but calm, nodded, repeating softly, "Home." The descent pressed harder. Turbulence jolted them again, trays rattled, strained. Her hand tightened on the mic, but her voice remained clear. "Speed stable, heading confirmed. Clearance for final approach acknowledged, flaps down." The captain followed her cadence. The first officer monitored instruments with hawk-like intensity. Together, their movements became a choreography of survival. The city grew larger beneath them, glowing grids of streetlights, rivers of headlights along highways, the sharp flash of emergency vehicles lined along the runway. Fire trucks, ambulances, lights blazing red and yellow. A stage prepared for disaster, waiting to see whether survival or tragedy would write its final act. In the cabin, whispers rose. "Look, the lights, the ground, we're almost there." But almost was not enough. In the cockpit, sweat traced the captain's temple. His voice was low, hoarse. "Crosswinds are sharp. Flare timing has to be perfect. One mistake will bounce, maybe worse." She steadied the mic. "Maintain glide slope. Confirm touchdown speed. Gear deployed, flaps full." Her words became rhythm. Her rhythm became anchor. The jet obeyed as though her voice itself commanded gravity. "Passenger 89, Viper 1, the escort's voice cut in again. "Final approach confirmed. You're clear to land, we'll stay close." She pressed transmit, her tone unwavering. "Copy, Viper 1, final approach. Maintaining heading, thank you." The A-10s dipped slightly, adjusting their positions, granting the civilian jet room to maneuver. But their presence remained constant, watchful, guardians to the last. Inside the cabin, a hush spread. Fear and hope braided into one taut thread. Mothers held children tightly. Strangers clasped hands. The businessman who had cursed hours before now whispered prayers of gratitude, his voice trembling. The runway lights grew sharper, the ground closer, the hum of engines deepened. "Steady," she whispered, her voice audible only to the cockpit but carrying the weight of command. "Steady, glide slope aligned, speed confirmed, brace for touchdown." Every passenger, every crew member, every soul on board held their breath as the jet dipped closer. the runway blazing like a river of fire beneath them. The moment hung in the air, stretched taut between survival and disaster. And through it all, her voice remained the one constant, the one anchor, the one shield against silence. What if the hardest part of survival isn't fear itself, but the silence that comes just before the unknown? The cabin of Flight 217 had fallen into that silence. Not the silence of calm, but the heavy, breathless stillness that comes when every soul waits for impact. Creaked as passengers gripped armrests, white-knuckled, eyes squeezed shut. Some whispered prayers. Others stared straight ahead, too paralyzed to blink. A child whimpered against her mother's chest, the mother's own eyes wet though she forced her voice to soothe. From the windows, the ground was no longer distant. Denver city lights sprawled below like a living constellation, highways pulsing with headlights, neighborhoods glowing warm. But the most visible lights were the emergency crews lined along the runway, fire trucks, ambulances, police vehicles, all waiting, their beacons flashing like warnings in the night. It was a sight that carved deeper fear into the hearts of those who saw it. In the cockpit, sweat gleamed on the captain's brow. His voice cracked with intensity. "Crosswinds are brutal. I'll need perfect timing on the flare or we're in trouble." The first officer's hands trembled slightly as he monitored instruments. Glide slope holding, but winds shifting fast. Through it all, passenger 89 sat between them, headset tight, mic pressed close. Her body screamed with exhaustion, throat raw, hands trembling, but her voice was the one thing she refused to let break. "Denver Tower, Flight 217 on final approach," she transmitted, calm and deliberate. "Crew intact. Civilian aircraft. Negative hostile intent. Request immediate clearance to land." The tower replied, steady but urgent. "Flight 217, runway 35 left cleared. Winds gusting 25 knots, crosswind advisory in effect. Emergency services on standby. You are cleared to land." She relayed instantly, her tone clipped and unwavering. "Runway 35 left cleared, crosswind acknowledged, landing confirmed." The captain nodded, jaw locked. His hands clenched the yoke with grim determination. Outside, the warthogs tightened formation, their silhouettes ghost-like in the dark sky. Their presence was steady, wings angled, engines growling low. Guardians in steel, they hovered as close as safety allowed, refusing to abandon the fragile airliner until the very end. "Flight 217, Viper 1's voice cut through, lower now measured. "We're with you to the ground, hold steady." Her chest tightened, but she answered evenly. "Copy, Viper 1, holding steady." The descent deepened. Air roared louder around the fuselage. Turbulence jolted the cabin violently, oxygen masks swaying overhead. Gasps and cries rippled through passengers. "Steady," she whispered into the mic, her tone clipped, not for herself but for the men flying beside her. "Glide slope aligned, descent rate stable, flaps full, gear confirmed." The captain adjusted controls with surgical precision. The first officer's voice shook as he confirmed speeds. The jet dipped lower, closer, runway lights glaring like an oncoming tide of fire. In the cabin, the silence shattered into raw noise. Someone screamed. A man shouted prayers at the top of his lungs. The child sobbed again. Yet somehow, above the chaos, the flight attendants forced their voices firm, repeating what she had told them earlier. "The fighters are protecting us. We are going home. Trust the wings outside." Those words spread like fragile threads. Not everyone believed, but enough did. And belief steadied fear, even if only a fraction. The cockpit shook violently as another gust slammed the fuselage. The plane dipped hard, wings rocking. "Correcting," the captain barked, fighting the yoke. His arms strained, muscles taut. "Hold slope," she commanded, her voice unwavering even as her heart pounded. "Flare timing critical, eyes on speed." The captain's jaw clenched, his knuckles whitened, he obeyed. Outside, the A-10s dipped slightly in unison, as though bracing themselves with the airliner. refusing to let their guardianship break. The runway surged closer. The lights blazed. The roar of engines deepened to a guttural growl. "Denver Tower," she transmitted, her voice calm but edged with steel. "Flight 217, short final. Brace for touchdown." Her words cut across airwaves not just as procedure, but as a promise. Passengers braced, their bodies rigid, breaths held. The businessman clutched his seat so hard his hands bled from fingernail marks, but his eyes stayed open, locked on the window, watching salvation rush toward them. The captain muttered under his breath, almost a prayer, "Come on, come on." The ground surged upward. The runway's edge lit like fire beneath their nose. The moment stretched, unbearable, infinite, the razor's edge where lives either end or continue. "Now," she said softly, her voice a command. The captain flared. The nose rose. Wheels screamed against asphalt. The fuselage jolted, bounced once, then steadied. A roar filled the cabin, part engine, part human. Passengers cried out, some in terror, some in relief, the two sounds blending until neither could be told apart. But the jet held. Tires screeched, smoke burst from friction, and the long body thundered down the runway, slowing with every heartbeat. The ground had them. Gravity had claimed them back. Speed decreasing, the first officer gasped, half a sob, half a laugh. "We're down, my God, we're down." Her voice cut clean across the moment, calm even through her trembling throat. "Tower, Flight 217. Touchdown confirmed. Negative hostile intent. All souls intact." The reply came fast, urgent but relieved. "Copy 217. Emergency cruise en route. Taxi clear when able." The captain eased the brakes, his breath ragged. Sweat poured down his face. His hands shook. But his voice was steady enough to say the words that mattered. "We're alive." The cabin erupted. Some sobbed loudly, collapsing against each other. Others laughed hysterically. A few sat frozen, unable to move, unable to accept that survival was real. But every single one of them was alive. Inside the cockpit, the headset crackled one last time. "Flight 217, Viper 1 said, his voice heavy with something more than protocol. "On behalf of the United States Air Force, welcome home." Her throat tightened. For the first time since this began, her composure threatened to break. She steadied her breathing, pressed transmit, and answered with the same calm that had carried them across the sky. "Thank you, Viper. Couldn't have done it without you." But the escorts weren't finished. Viper 2 cut in, his tone softer than it had ever been. "Passenger 89, you didn't just talk us through. You carried them all. You carried us too." Her hand trembled as she lowered the mic. She said nothing, because she knew words weren't always enough. Sometimes silence carried more truth than any phrase. The A-10s peeled away, banking into the night, their silhouettes fading into stars. But in their departure they left behind something no passenger, no crew, no controller would ever forget. Not just survival, not just rescue, but the knowledge that one steady voice had been enough to hold back the abyss. Why did silence feel heavier on the ground than it ever had in the sky? Aircraft rolled slowly, brakes squealing, engines groaning under the strain of deceleration. The lights of emergency vehicles blazed on either side of the runway, casting the fuselage in pools of red and yellow. Fire crews stood ready, hoses angled, faces tense. Ambulances idled with doors open, stretchers waiting. Police cruisers blocked access roads, officers scanning every movement of the jet. It was a scene of war, not peace. A stage prepared for tragedy, stunned to witness survival instead. Inside the cabin, relief clashed with exhaustion. Passengers sobbed openly, some clutching one another as though refusing to release proof of life. A mother rocked her child, her lips trembling with prayers of thanks. A man laughed uncontrollably, his body shuddering with the release of terror. Others sat frozen, staring blankly, unable to believe wheels truly touched earth again. The flight attendants moved quickly, their polished professionalism broken, replaced with raw humanity. They wiped tears from their cheeks while instructing passengers to remain seated. Their voices cracked, but they pressed on. "Please stay calm. We'll disembark shortly. Stay seated until we receive clearance." In the cockpit, the captain released the yoke with trembling hands. His shoulders sagged as though every mile flown had been etched into his bones. The first officer slumped back, covering his face with both hands, laughter and tears mixing into the same broken sound. Passenger 89 sat rigid still, headset pressed to her ears, the mic slack in her hand. Her throat was scorched, her muscles trembling, her heart pounding so hard it echoed in her chest. She had spoken strength into existence for hours, but now that survival was real, her strength trembled with the weight of it all. "Flight 217, the tower called again. "Taxi clear of runway when able. Emergency cruise in position. You are secure." She pressed the mic with a steady hand, though her voice betrayed the faintest rasp. "Copy tower, 217 clear of runway, all souls intact." The captain guided the aircraft toward a cordon of flashing lights. Dozens of emergency vehicles lined the taxiway. Faces turned upward, firefighters, paramedics, police, airport staff, each watching the fragile vessel they had expected to greet with flames. Now they watched it roll forward under its own power, battered but whole. "God," the first officer whispered. "Look at them. They were waiting to pull bodies from wreckage." The captain's voice cracked. "Instead, they'll see them walk out alive." The plane halted near the terminal, surrounded instantly by fire trucks and ambulances. Crews surged forward, forming a ring of readiness around the jet. Stairs rolled quickly to the door. The cabin crew released the locks with trembling hands. "Ladies and," the lead attendant's voice broke through the intercom, heavy with emotion, "we are safe. Please gather your belongings carefully and prepare to disembark." The cabin erupted again, sobs, laughter, whispered prayers. Passengers stumbled to their feet, some too weak to stand without help. They moved slowly toward the exit, stepping into the cold night air under flashing lights. On the tarmac, the first to emerge was the mother with her child pressed tightly against her chest. A firefighter reached for her, guiding her gently down the stairs, his face breaking into something between relief and disbelief. Behind her came the businessman, his bravado stripped away, tears streaking his face as he muttered thanks to anyone who would listen. Others followed, some weeping openly, some moving silently as though afraid the ground might vanish beneath them. The crowd of responders watched, silent at first. Then applause began, hesitant, then swelling. Not applause for spectacle, but for survival. A raw, human sound carrying awe and gratitude in equal measure. In the cockpit, the captain finally unbuckled, turning toward her. His eyes were bloodshot, his voice rough. "You held us together. Without you, I don't know what would happen." The first officer nodded fervently, tears streaking his face. "You were the voice we needed. We didn't just land because of skill. We landed because of you." She shook her head faintly, exhaustion heavy in her features. "No, you landed us. I only spoke." But the captain's gaze held steady. "Sometimes words are the difference between chaos and survival. Don't diminish what you did." She looked away, throat tightening. She had never sought recognition. She had never wanted a stage. She had only wanted survival for herself, for the strangers around her. At last, she unbuckled and followed them out. The air hit her sharply, cold and sharp, filling her lungs with relief that hurt. Flashing lights bathed her in pulses of red and gold. Faces turned as she descended the stairs, firefighters and police staring at her as though trying to place the quiet figure who had carried an airliner on her voice. Some passengers pointed discreetly, whispers chasing her steps. "That's her, the woman who spoke to the fighters, the one who kept us alive." She kept her eyes down. She did not crave their attention. She only wanted quiet. But quiet would not come. On the edge of the cordon, a cluster of Air Force officers stood waiting. Their uniforms were sharp, their faces solemn. They had come directly from the base, summoned the moment the warthogs were scrambled. They had listened to her voice through recordings relayed to command. They had known her only as Passenger 89. Now they saw her in flesh. One officer stepped forward, his rank glinting under the lights. He extended his hand, his tone heavy with respect. "Ma'am, on behalf of the United States Air Force, thank you." She hesitated, her hand trembling slightly before she shook his. "I only did what was needed." His jaw tightened. What was needed saved 200 lives, and protected our pilots too, don't diminish it. Behind him, others nodded. Their eyes carried something she had not expected, not pity, not curiosity, but respect. True, unfeigned respect. Yet she could not absorb it, not fully. The weight of survival pressed too heavily against her chest. The roar of engines, the tremor of turbulence, the endless static of radios, it all still clung to her bones. A firefighter approached, his helmet under his arm. "Ma'am, were you really a passenger? Just a passenger?" She met his gaze. For a moment her lips parted as though she might explain the training buried in her past, the skills long left behind. But instead she only said, "Yes, just a passenger." Because she knew the truth, passengers weren't meant to carry weight like this, and yet she had. Around her, survivors reunited with family. Tears, embraces, laughter that bordered on hysteria filled the night. The businessman clung to a wife who rushed across the tarmac, his body shaking with sobs. The mother kissed her child's head again and again, whispering promises of safety. Strangers who had been silent hours before now embraced like kin, bound forever by shared survival. And still through it all whispers followed her. Not accusations, not suspicion, but reverence. She was the voice, she was the bridge, she was why we lived. She stood in the middle of flashing lights, exhaustion pulling at every nerve, unable to stop trembling. She had carried them through the sky, but now that survival was certain, she felt the breaking weight of it. Her voice had not faltered in the air, but now, on the ground, she felt it splinter inside her. What happens when the world wants to call you a hero, but you only wanted to survive? The night air bit colder now, long after the last passenger had stepped onto the tarmac. The floodlights still blazed, casting stark shadows across the fuselage of Flight 217, but the chaos had settled into aftermath. Fire trucks idled, their crews standing down. Ambulances waited, some taking passengers who had fainted or collapsed from shock. Police kept reporters at bay, though their cameras glowed red, hungry for the first survivor's words. She lingered near the edge of the cordon, apart from the crowd. She had spoken with calm authority for hours, but now silence pressed heavier than any headset. Her throat ached, her muscles trembled, her heart felt bruised inside her chest. She wanted nothing but stillness, nothing but quiet. But quiet never lasts when the world demands an explanation. "Passenger 89, someone shouted. A cluster of reporters pressed against the barricade, cameras flashing, voices overlapping in a cacophony. "How did you know what to say? Were you part of the crew? Are you military? Did you save the flight?" She turned her face away. She did not want to be the story. She had carried the weight already. Let them ask their questions of others. Let them write their headlines. She had nothing left to give. The captain found her before she could retreat fully. His face was pale, his eyes red-rimmed, his voice rough but steady. "They'll never understand it the way we do. What you did up there, it wasn't just survival. You gave us something to hold on to. You gave us calm when we were drowning in chaos." She shook her head faintly. "You flew us home, you and your first officer, the rest." Her voice cracked, the rawness finally bleeding through. "The rest was just words." The captain placed a hand on her shoulder, firm but gentle. "Sometimes words are the only wings we have." She had no answer, only silence. From across the tarmac came a low, rising sound, engines. Heads turned as two dark shapes streaked back into view. The A-10s. They had landed at the nearby base but had returned, circling low over the airport in formation. Their blunt silhouettes gleamed under the floodlights, their wings steady, their presence unshakable. As they passed over the runway, they dipped in unison, a precise, deliberate roll of respect, a salute from warriors of the sky to the woman whose voice had carried them all. Gasps rippled through the crowd of survivors and responders. Some applauded, some wept, others stood in stunned silence. She watched the maneuver, her throat tightening. She had spoken to those voices for hours, unseen, faceless. Now their steel shadows saluted her not as a passenger, not as a stranger, but as one of their own. The warthogs roared once more, then vanished into the night, leaving only the echo of engines in the cold air. Tears burned her eyes, not for herself, for the hundreds who had leaned on her calm, for the ones who had stared at her with terror and found steadiness instead, for the burden she had carried without asking, without wanting. One firefighter approached softly, helmet tucked under his arm. "Ma'am, people are saying you're a hero." She shook her head. "Heroes are the ones who trained for this, who flew the escorts, who pulled us down on the runway. I was just a voice." He studied her for a moment, then nodded slowly. "Sometimes a voice is enough." Hours passed before the passengers were moved into terminals, families reunited, statements collected. The frenzy of media thickened, but she slipped past it quietly, her steps deliberate, her face turned away from cameras. She carried no suitcase, no baggage beyond the weight of what she had endured. In a quiet corner of the terminal, she finally sat, her body folding into the chair with exhaustion so deep it felt endless. Around her, survivors embraced loved ones, laughter and tears colliding in cathartic chaos. She watched them silently, relief mingling with something more complex, something heavier. She remembered the boy who had asked if the warthog was their protector, the mother who had repeated her words to soothe terrified strangers, the businessman who had gone from arrogance to prayer. Each of them had lived because a voice had bridged silence. And yet, she felt no triumph, only the ache of having carried weight no one was meant to carry. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. Messages poured in, missed calls, notifications, numbers she didn't recognize. Word had already spread. Passenger 89, the voice on the radio, the woman who saved a flight. She powered it off. She didn't want her name to become a story. She didn't want headlines or interviews. She only wanted to breathe again. The captain found her once more before dawn broke. His voice was quieter now, more personal than professional. "We'll never forget what you did, and maybe the world will turn you into something bigger than you are. But I hope you know this, we're alive because of you. That's the truth, no matter what you call it." She looked at him, her eyes heavy but unwavering. "I don't need the world to know. I only need to know that everyone walked away. That's enough." He nodded, understanding. When the sun finally rose, it painted the Rockies in pale gold, washing the airport in soft light. The chaos of the night receded slowly, replaced by the ordinary hum of flights resuming, of passengers boarding other planes, of life continuing as if nothing extraordinary had happened. But for those who had been on Flight 217, nothing would ever be ordinary again. They would remember the silence in the sky, the roar of engines beside them, the trembling descent, and above all, the steady voice that refused to break. She walked quietly out of the terminal as dawn bloomed. No cameras followed. No crowds surrounded her. She disappeared into the world like any other passenger, a figure swallowed by the rhythm of ordinary life. But those who knew, those who had lived, would never forget. Because sometimes salvation doesn't roar in with power or blaze with heroics. Sometimes it doesn't wear rank or uniform. Sometimes it is simply a voice, steady, unshaken, carrying dignity through the storm. And sometimes dignity doesn't speak. It simply acts.